The hills of West Virginia in the spring of 1971 were a deep, breathing green. Dogwood blossoms dotted the woods like scattered lace, and the air carried the damp, fertile scent of thawing earth and coal dust. Life in these small, tucked-away towns moved to an ancient rhythm: the shift whistle at the mine, the morning chatter at the diner, the quiet hum of a community where generations were rooted in the same soil. It was a place of handshake deals and unlocked doors, where the night was dark and silent, punctuated only by the chorus of crickets. This was Willow Creek, a picture of Appalachian serenity. But this peace was a fragile vessel, soon to be shattered by a single violent act whose echoes would not fade for half a century. The idyllic landscape, on the brink of tragedy, held its breath. To simply call Sarah Jenkins a victim would be to erase the vibrant, complex person she was. At 19, she was the bright-eyed clerk at Miller's Five and Dime, but her dreams stretched far beyond the town limits. She spent her lunch breaks with a book propped against the cash register, studying for her teaching certificate. Her voice, a clear soprano, would often join in with the folk music that drifted from porch swings on summer evenings, songs of mountains and longing that she felt deeply. She had a habit of tucking a wildflower behind her ear if she found one on her walk to work, and she saved her pennies in a mason jar labeled college. Those who knew her remember a specific, warm laugh that could ease a troubled day. She was deeply woven into the fabric of Willow Creek, a daughter, a friend, a dreamer. Presenting her as this fully realized young woman on the very cusp of her future is what makes the story that follows not just a mystery, but a profound tragedy. Her absence would not just be a space, it would be a reversal of a life moving joyfully forward. Sarah's world was a small, intimate solar system, and she was its sun. In her orbit was her older brother James, who had inherited their father's protective nature and worked at the same mine. He saw the men who looked at his sister, and he made his assessments with a quiet, unwavering gaze. Then there was Mary Ellen, her best friend since childhood, a confidant who shared every secret, every hope, and every fear. Theirs was a bond forged in schoolyard games and solidified in teenage dreams. And there was David Miller, her steady boyfriend, the son of the shop owner. He was shy, a man of few words, devoted to Sarah but carrying a nervous energy that sometimes made him hard to read. Beyond this inner circle, the town itself was a cast of characters. There was Walter Brennan, the reclusive Vietnam vet who lived on the edge of town, his eyes holding a 1,000-yard stare that unnerved the children. And there was Leo Jenkins, the charismatic but notoriously troublemaking mechanic at the local garage, whose charm often masked a quick temper. In a community this small, everyone was connected, a fact that should have made the truth easy to find. Instead, it wove a web of shared history and unspoken loyalties where the truth could hide in plain sight. Willow Creek in 1971 was the kind of town where your business was everyone's business, and that was mostly considered a good thing. It was a place of shared burdens and shared joys, where a casserole appeared on your doorstep if you were sick, and neighbors showed up with tractors if your car was stuck in the mud. The architecture was a testament to its history. Clapboard houses with wide porches, the sturdy brick bank on Main Street, and the ever-present layer of coal dust that settled on everything, a fine gray powder that was the price of prosperity. At its heart, the community prided itself on its integrity and self-reliance. They believed they could handle their own problems. This fierce independence and ingrained trust, however, would become a double-edged sword. The very closeness that defined Willow Creek would, in the coming storm, make it impossible to see the predator in their midst. The secret that was about to be buried in their midst would fester for 50 years, a stark and terrible contrast to the town's proud, unblemished self-image. The night of Saturday, May 15, 1971, was unseasonably warm, the air still heavy with the day's heat. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah Jenkins was at 10:05 p.m., standing on the porch of her best friend Mary Ellen's house, bathed in the yellow glow of a single bug-speckled bulb. They had just gotten back from the Ridgeview Theater, where they'd seen Love Story. The two girls had dissected the film's tragic ending, their voices carrying in the quiet night. Sarah, clutching her small purse, declined a ride. "It's a beautiful night," she'd said. "I'll just take the shortcut. See you tomorrow." Her final steps are a ghost trail etched in mundane details. At approximately 10:12 p.m., old Mr. Hemmings, sitting on his porch on Main Street, saw a figure in a light-colored dress, likely Sarah, walk past with a purposeful stride. He offered a wave, but couldn't be sure it was returned in the deepening dark. From there, her path would have taken her past the last pool of light from the street lamp at the corner of Main and Oak, and then onto the dirt entrance of the wooded shortcut known as Hunter's Trace. This was a well-worn path, a gully of packed earth and exposed roots that sliced through the forest, saving a 15-minute walk. The moon, a sliver of silver, offered little illumination beneath the thick canopy of oaks. The timeline is terrifying in its precision and its utter normality. A young woman walking home after a movie, but at the threshold of those woods, the timeline simply stops. The record of Sarah Jenkins's life ends, and the mystery begins. The following morning, a Sunday, dawned bright and clear. It was the silence that first struck Eleanor Jenkins as unusual, the absence of her daughter's faint humming from down the hall. When she pushed open Sarah's bedroom door just after 8 o'clock a.m., she was met not with chaos, but with a scene of perfect, undisturbed order. The bed was made, the chenille spread pulled taut, untouched by a sleeping form. Her nightgown, the one with the little blue flowers, was neatly folded on the pillow. A library copy of To Kill a Mockingbird lay on the nightstand, a bus ticket stub marking her place. Everything was in its rightful position, a museum exhibit of a life interrupted. It was this eerie normality that was the most abnormal thing of all. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned chair, no scuff marks on the floor. The window was latched from the inside. Her favorite corduroy jacket, the one she wore almost daily, still hung on the hook behind the door. But her purse was gone. This was the impossible equation that would haunt the investigation for decades. If she had planned to run away, why leave her cherished jacket and her saved college money? If she had been taken by force, why was there no struggle, no disruption, no single piece of evidence to suggest a violent struggle? The empty bedroom was a locked room mystery, a silent, sun-drenched crime scene that offered nothing but questions. The worry began as a low hum, a nagging feeling in her brother James's gut when Sarah didn't appear for breakfast. By 10 a.m., that hum had escalated into a sharp, ringing alarm. The telephone, a heavy rotary dial model, became the center of a frantic operation. James called Mary Ellen. He called David Miller. He called every friend and relative in the dog-eared address book. Each call ended the same way. No, we haven't seen her. The fear in the Jenkins household was now a physics. All presence, thick and suffocating. When Sheriff Ed Tolliver was finally called, his response embodied the era's limitations. This was a man who dealt with drunk and disorderly charges and the occasional stolen tractor. A missing teenager was uncharted territory. There was no protocol for a statewide alert, no database to instantly flash her photograph. The investigation began with the most analog of tools, the human voice and human legs. Sheriff Tolliver, his gut a knot of dread, organized a handful of deputies and volunteers. They fanned out from the Jenkins home, calling Sarah's name into the quiet woods. By afternoon, the local print shop had run off 500 flyers on cheap, yellowing paper, with a grainy school photo of Sarah smiling. These flyers were tacked to telephone poles, taped to the diner's window, and handed out at the mine gate. In 1971, this was the cutting edge of search and rescue. A community's eyes and ears, and the desperate hope that someone had seen something. As the search intensified, the wooded path of Hunter's Trace became the epicenter of the investigation, a crime scene with no defined borders. The initial sweep was chaotic, a cacophony of shouted names and crashing footsteps that destroyed any potential subtle evidence. Men with dogs worked the trail, but the dogs, confused by the scent of countless previous walkers and the previous night's search party, would run in frantic circles before losing the trail entirely. The forest itself seemed to be a silent accomplice. Every potential clue dissolved upon inspection. A broken twig at shoulder height suggested a struggle, but it was followed by no other signs. A discarded Lucky Strike cigarette pack sparked a fleeting hope, only to be traced to a teenager who admitted he'd been there the day before. The ground, still damp from a spring shower, should have held impressions, but the search party's own boot prints had churned the earth into a muddy quilt of useless information. There was no dropped earring, no shred of torn fabric caught on a bramble, no drag marks leading off the path. The absence of evidence was itself the evidence, a void that offered no starting point, no narrative. For the detectives, it was like trying to reconstruct a ghost. How do you solve a puzzle when the central pieces, a body, a weapon, a clear sign of violence, are missing? The forest gave them nothing but shadows and silence. By Monday evening, 48 hours after Sarah had vanished, the frantic energy that had fueled the search began to gutter and die. The volunteers, who had taken time off from the mines and their families, had to return to their lives. Their faces were etched with a new emotion, a weary, helpless acceptance. The sheriff's leads, so promising in their infancy, had all turned to dead ends. The report of a strange, dark sedan parked near the woods was tracked to a salesman. Visiting from Beckley, his alibi solid. The rumor of a heated argument between Sarah and a mysterious man outside the drugstore was debunked. It had been a different couple entirely. Each false hope had consumed precious hours, and with each one that collapsed, the investigation lost momentum. The critical window, that golden period when most missing persons cases are solved, was not just closing, it was slamming shut. The phones at the sheriff's office fell silent. The new flyers posted downtown began to curl at the edges, bleached by the sun. The case was not yet officially cold, but a chilling quiet had settled over Willow Creek. The community's collective hope, once a blazing fire, was now just embers and ash. And the unsettling truth was dawning. Sarah Jenkins was gone, and she had left no trace. In any missing person case, the last person to see the victim is automatically cast in a shadow of suspicion, and David Miller found himself trapped in that harsh, unforgiving light. He was nervous when detectives first questioned him, his hands fidgeting, his eyes darting around the Jenkins living room. His alibi for Saturday night was a solitary one. He claimed he was in his parents' garage, the one behind the house on Elm Street, alone, tuning up the engine of his Chevy Impala. There were no witnesses to verify his story, no phone calls made, no one to vouch for his whereabouts during the critical window between 10 o'clock p.m. and midnight. Under the pressure of repeated questioning, his story developed minor, nagging inconsistencies. Was the garage door open or closed? What specific part was he working on? To the seasoned detectives, these were the cracks through which guilt often seeped. The town, eager for a target, began to weave its own narrative. Whispers followed David at the diner. Former friends would cross the street to avoid him. He was the obvious suspect, the boyfriend with the shaky story, and the investigation zeroed in on him with intense focus. They scrutinized his past, interviewed his coworkers, and even searched his car and the garage for any trace of Sarah. But without a body, without a crime scene, and without any forensic evidence linking him to her disappearance, the case was built on circumstantial sand. There was no blood, no hair, no fiber, no confession. The intense pressure yielded nothing but a crumbling alibi, and without physical proof, the district attorney refused to file charges. The case against David Miller, for all the suspicion and town gossip, collapsed under the weight of its own insubstantiality, leaving the investigation without a compass. When the investigation into David Miller hit a dead end, the community and the sheriff, his department, desperately needed a new direction. It arrived in the form of a long-haul trucker named Earl Peterson, who came forward 2 weeks after Sarah's disappearance. He reported that on the night of May 15th, around 11:30 p.m., he had seen a disheveled-looking man, a hitchhiker with a heavy backpack, thumbing for a ride on State Route 19, about 5 miles from the mouth of Hunter's Trace. This was the spark that ignited the drifter theory, a convenient and psychologically comforting narrative for a town unable to accept that the danger might have come from within. The idea of an external predator, a random evil passing through, was far easier to stomach than the thought of a neighbor's hidden darkness. The investigation pivoted dramatically. Resources were poured into tracking down every transient, every vagrant, every man with a questionable past who had been within a 50-mile radius. Detectives spent weeks following fruitless leads on hitchhikers who had been arrested for minor offenses in neighboring counties. The phantom of the unknown drifter consumed the investigation for months, a classic red herring that provided a temporary outlet for the town's collective fear and the department's need for action. But every potential drifter was eventually accounted for or cleared. This diversion, while understandable, was a catastrophic misdirection. It pulled valuable time and manpower away from the people who knew Sarah, the intricate web of relationships in Willow Creek, where the true answer almost certainly lay. The pursuit of this phantom cemented the case's stagnation, leading the investigation down a dark alley that ended, irrevocably, at a brick wall. By the spring of 1973, the file on Sarah Jenkins had grown thick with dead ends. It contained dog-eared statements from nervous boyfriends and speculative truckers, faded maps of the woods with search grids penciled in, and the original, now brittle missing person flyers. The teletype machines had long fallen silent with alerts about her. The leads had not so much dried up as evaporated. In a quiet administrative ceremony that felt like a surrender, Sheriff Tolliver officially reclassified the case from active to cold. A deputy carried the heavy cardboard box down to the basement storage room, a dim, dusty space that held the ghosts of other unresolved tragedies. The box was labeled Jenkins, Sarah, 05-15-71, and placed on a metal shelf between a stolen property case from 1968 and an unsolved burglary. This was the institutional wall. The case was now a piece of history, a bureaucratic defeat. Outwardly, the town of Willow Creek tried to move on. Life, as it does, continued. But the unanswered question of Sarah's disappearance became a permanent, unspoken scar on the community's conscience. It was a subject avoided at the dinner table, a pain tucked away behind the daily routines of work and family. But it was always there, a silent, cold weight in the corner of every room. While the official investigation filed Sarah Jenkins away, her family refused to let her memory be archived. For her brother James and her mother Eleanor, the case never went cold. Their living room became a sacred, sorrowful war room. Boxes of notes, meticulously organized in Eleanor's graceful handwriting, sat beside stacks of correspondence with private investigators from as far away as New York, men who offered hope for a price. There were maps pinned to a corkboard, with routes circled in red, and a worn photograph of Sarah, her smile forever frozen in time, presiding over it all. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, they held a quiet vigil. They would sit on the porch as the evening of May 15th settled, saying little, simply remembering. There were no cameras, no crowds, just a mother and a brother keeping a flame alive in the overwhelming dark. James, in particular, aged under the weight of this unresolved grief. The protective older brother had failed in his most fundamental duty, and he channeled that guilt into a relentless private pursuit. He would drive to neighboring towns on weekends showing the faded flyer, following up on tips that the sheriff had long dismissed. This unwavering quest for answers was a testament to a love that refused to be defeated by time, but it came at a profound personal cost. A life lived in the long, cold shadow of a sister who never came home. For Deputy Roy Miller, who had been one of the first responders on that Sunday morning in 1971, the Jenkins case was more than a file. It was a ghost that took up residence in his mind and refused to leave. As the years turned into decades, he rose through the ranks to detective, but no promotion could lift the weight of this one unsolved mystery. Now, nearing retirement, his hair gone gray and his once sharp eyes framed by wrinkles of worry, he made a habit of visiting the basement storage room. He would open the Jenkins box, the cardboard smell of old paper and dust filling the air. He'd lay out the contents on a small table, the transcript of David Miller's shaky alibi, the statement from the trucker Earl Peterson, the grainy photographs of Hunter's trace. He wasn't looking for something he missed. He was waiting for a piece of the puzzle to suddenly click, for a connection to reveal itself through some alchemy of time and perspective. He'd stare at the school photo of Sarah, her bright eyes seeming to hold a question he couldn't answer. This was not standard procedure. It was a personal, almost ritualistic penance. The case haunted him because it represented a fundamental breach of the town's compact. In Willow Creek, people were supposed to be safe. He had made a silent promise to the Jenkins family and to himself that he would not forget. And so, every few months, Detective Roy Miller would commune with the ghost in the file, hoping that this time she would finally speak to him. Over the decades, the story of Sarah Jenkins hardened into local legend, a cautionary tale parents told their children about walking alone at night. But for the adults who remembered 1971, the case was a slow-acting poison in the town's bloodstream. The unsolved mystery bred a subtle but persistent distrust that seeped into the foundations of the community. It was there in the lie, Garing glances at the annual Founders' Day picnic, the unspoken questions about the men who had been under suspicion. Families who had been friends for generations found themselves growing distant, the weight of silent accusations hanging between them. The town's self-image, once built on trust and mutual reliance, was permanently tainted. They could no longer look at each other with the same unguarded ease. The secret of what truly happened to Sarah Jenkins festered like a hidden wound, and because the truth was unknown, anyone could be guilty. The collective conscience of Willow Creek was burdened with a shared, unspoken guilt. The guilt of not knowing, of maybe not wanting to know, and of having failed to protect one of their own. The town had tried to move on, but it was forever stuck in 1971, its innocence lost not just to a crime, but to the terrifying uncertainty that followed. The year 2020 brought a quiet revolution to the cold, dusty storage rooms of West Virginia's justice system. A state-funded initiative, the Cold Case Justice Project, aimed to use the formidable power of modern forensic science to breathe life into investigations like Sarah Jenkins's. The call reached a now-retired detective Roy Miller, who had carried the weight of the case for 49 years. His voice trembled with a palpable mix of hope and trepidation as he gave his immediate, fervent approval. The process began not with a dramatic flourish, but with the meticulous, sterile precision of a forensic lab. Technicians, gloved and masked, carefully opened the aged evidence box. Their focus was on the clothing Sarah had been wearing when she last visited Mary Ellen, a light-colored dress, preserved for decades in a paper evidence envelope. The goal was to isolate a male DNA profile from the minute skin cells, the invisible biological dust that might have been transferred during a struggle. The DNA they sought was old, degraded, a fragile thread of genetic code broken down by time. Using a technique called PCR amplification, a molecular photocopying machine, they worked to rebuild a usable profile from these damaged fragments. It was a painstaking, week-long ballet of chemicals and centrifuges, all focused on a single, silent question. Could a microscopic residue, clinging to a 50-year-old garment, finally hold the key to a half-century of silence? The successful extraction of a partial male DNA profile was a monumental victory, but it was only the first step. This tiny digital string of code was now entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, a vast national database of known offenders. Simultaneously, given the age of the case, detectives also turned to commercial genetic genealogy databases, uploading the profile to see if it would find a familial link among the millions of people who had used services to explore their ancestry. Then, the waiting began. This was the proverbial search for a needle in a haystack, a process fraught with bureaucratic hurdles and agonizing silence. While computers ran their endless comparisons, the newly formed cold case team refused to remain idle. They worked in the background, building a new digital timeline of Sarah's last hours. They tracked down and re-interviewed the aging players in the drama. Mary Ellen, now a grandmother; David Miller, who had long since moved away; James Jenkins, his body frail but his resolve ironclad. These conversations were poignant and often painful, stirring up memories that had been carefully compartmentalized for decades. The team cross-referenced old statements, looking for inconsistencies that new technology could now test. Every day was an exercise in managed expectation, a balance between the grinding, methodical work of traditional investigation and the desperate, silent hope for a single, life-altering ping from a database that could transform a 50-year-old mystery back into an active homicide investigation. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in early 2021, its subject line bland and bureaucratic. CODIS familial match, Jenkins S. The lead detective on the cold case team opened it, his heart hammering against his ribs. The hit was not a direct match to a convicted felon in the system. Instead, it was a familial link, a moderate string of shared DNA markers pointing to a relative of the unknown suspect. Using this genetic breadcrumb, a genealogist working with the police painstakingly built out a family tree, branching backwards and then forwards through generations until it narrowed to a single, shocking name. The name was not that of a stranger. It was not the phantom drifter or the troubled boyfriend. It was a name that appeared in the original yellowed pages of the 1971 case file. He had been interviewed briefly, almost as an afterthought, a peripheral figure in Sarah's orbit. He had provided a simple, unchallenged alibi and was subsequently dismissed. For 50 years, he had been just another name in a list, a face in the crowd of a small town, hiding in plain sight. The revelation was staggering in its simplicity and its profound betrayal. The answer had not been lost in the woods or on a highway. It had been sitting in a file cabinet all along, waiting for science to give it a voice. The suspect was identified as Thomas "Tom" Riggs, now 72 years old. The revelation sent a seismic shock through the investigation team. Riggs was not a shadowy outsider. He was a pillar of the Willow Creek community. A retired foreman from the same mine where James Jenkins had worked, he was a deacon at the local church, a married grandfather known for his immaculate lawn and his willingness to help a neighbor in need. He was the embodiment of the town's values, a living representation of everything they believed about themselves. This stark contrast between his public persona and his hidden past was the very core of the shocking arrest to come. To build an incontrovertible case, detectives needed a fresh sample of his DNA to confirm the match beyond any legal doubt. They initiated a delicate covert surveillance operation. For days, they watched Riggs's routines. They saw him as the town saw him, a kindly old man getting his mail, having coffee at the diner, waving to friends. The mission was to obtain his DNA without his knowledge, and their opportunity came when he visited a local park. After he sat on a bench and finished a takeout coffee, a detective posing as a city worker collected the discarded cup he left behind. The cup was rushed to the state lab. The confirmation came back a few days later, a perfect match to the DNA profile found on Sarah Jenkins's dress. Thomas Riggs, the respected grandfather, was irrevocably linked to the 50-year-old crime. The interrogation of Thomas Riggs took place in a modern, softly lit room, a world away from the more confrontational tactics of 1971. Two detectives, one male, one female, employed the false friend technique, speaking in calm, respectful tones. They began not with an accusation, but by asking him to help them clarify a few things about the old Jenkins case, appealing to his standing as a community pillar. They presented the DNA evidence not as a theory, but as an established, unassailable fact, a fait accompli. "Tom, we know you were there that night," the lead detective said, his voice even. "Science doesn't lie. Your DNA was found on Sarah's clothing. We're not here to ask if it happened. We're here to understand why." Riggs's facade began a slow, painful collapse. His initial expression of confused cooperation tightened into a mask of strained patience. He claimed he must have brushed against her in town sometime, a pathetic explanation the detectives gently dismantled by explaining the specificity of transfer and the condition of the evidence. As they systematically closed every possible door of innocent explanation, his demeanor shifted again. The feigned cooperation evaporated, replaced by a stoic, weary silence. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes glazing over, looking at a point somewhere in the distant past. He did not confess. He offered no dramatic monologue. But his silence in the face of such overwhelming evidence was itself a damning conclusion. He had carried the secret for 50 years, and now that it was out, he had nothing left to say. The confrontation ended not with a bang, but with the heavy, resonant quiet of a truth finally and irrevocably exposed. The arrest of Thomas Riggs was a quiet, surgical procedure, devoid of the drama the town might have expected. It happened at 6:02 on a Tuesday morning, a knock on the door of his Well-Key PT Ranch House on Maple Street. The disbelief that rippled through Willow Creek was not about the arrest itself, but about the man in handcuffs. This wasn't the shadowy drifter of local lore or the troubled boyfriend from decades past. This was Tom Riggs, a man who had handed out hymnals every Sunday, who had organized the charity auction for the volunteer fire department, a man whose grandchildren played in the same parks he had. The shock was less about the existence of a monster, and more about the terrifying realization that the monster had been their neighbor, their friend, a man they had trusted for generations. The foundation of the town's self-perception cracked that morning. The arrest proved that the most profound evil was not an external force invading their peace, but a rot that had been growing silently within it all along. The trial of Thomas Riggs was a stark clash between the past and the present. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of modern forensic science, built entirely on the cold, unassailable logic of DNA. Expert witnesses took the stand, explaining in meticulous detail the process of extracting the degraded profile from Sarah's dress, the statistical impossibility of it belonging to anyone else, and the confirmed match from the discarded coffee cup. They presented it as an irrefutable scientific fact, a digital ghost pointing directly at the defendant. The defense, unable to challenge the core science, was forced to attack the edges. They painted the original 1971 investigation as sloppy and corrupt, suggesting evidence had been mishandled or contaminated over 5 decades in a dusty evidence room. They tried to construct a narrative of reasonable doubt from the faded memories of dead witnesses and the lost protocols of a bygone era. But the emotional climax of the trial, the moment that transcended the technical testimony, came when James Jenkins was helped to the stand. Now in his 70s, his body frail but his voice steady with a lifetime of resolve, he directly addressed Thomas Riggs for the first time. He didn't scream or cry. He spoke of the vibrant sister who was stolen, the decades of silence, and the unending grief that had defined his family. He was not just a witness for the prosecution. He was the living embodiment of the cost of Riggs's secret, finally holding the man accountable in a way the legal system alone never could. When the foreperson uttered the word guilty, the courtroom did not erupt. Instead, it was swallowed by a heavy, exhausted silence, as if the building itself had been holding its breath for 50 years and could finally let it out. There were no tears of joy, only the slow, quiet tears of profound relief and resurfaced grief. For Mess Jenkins, the verdict was a release of a burden he had carried since he was a young man, the burden of not knowing, of fighting for a voice that had been silenced. But with that release came the painful reopening of a wound that had never truly healed. The victory was for justice, a confirmation that the system, however slow, could eventually function. Yet it was a hollow, aching victory. It could not bring back his sister. It could not restore the 50 years of life that had been stolen from her, or from his family. The verdict closed a legal chapter, but it also made the finality of Sarah's death and the devastating longevity of the lie brutally and officially real. In the wake of the trial, the town of Willow Creek was left to grapple with a painful new reality. The simple, trusting identity it had clung to was gone forever. It could no longer see itself as a place apart from the evil in the world, because that evil had been sipping coffee at the counter of the local diner for 50 years. The trauma rippled outwards, most cruelly affecting Riggs's own family, who were shunned and ostracized, ultimately forced to sell their home and leave the only town they had ever known, bearing a shame they had not earned. For James Jenkins, the path forward was about reclamation. He spoke of establishing the Sarah Jenkins Memorial Scholarship, a fund for local students pursuing education. This was his final, defiant act, an effort to rescue his sister's memory from the tragedy of her death and ensure that she would be remembered not as a cold case file, but as a vibrant young woman whose legacy could inspire future generations. It was a way to pick up the pieces and build something beautiful from the ruins of a shattered life. The hills of West Virginia remain as eternal as they were in the spring of 1971. The story of Willow Creek is a testament to the persistence of truth, a reminder that time does not erase a crime, it only makes the evidence harder to find. This case was solved not by a sudden confession or a deathbed revelation, but by the quiet, relentless march of science. A technology that gave a voice to a silent biological witness and finally spoke for Sarah when she no longer could. But beyond the DNA and the databases, the real engine of this half-century quest was love, the enduring, stubborn love of a brother and a mother who simply refused to forget. So, as this story concludes, we are left not with the grim image of a criminal, but with the youthful, hopeful face of Sarah Jenkins, forever frozen in time. The most respectful C. All to action we can offer is the simplest one. Say her name, remember her story, and in doing so, help ensure that a life is defined not by its ending, but by the light it cast while it burned.